One, two.
What up, girl?
What up? Oh my goodness. I'm so excited today for this very special episode that we have for everybody. Are you so excited, Emmy?
I'm excited. I'm just gonna sit here and let it happen to me.
All right. So, in case our listeners are not aware, this is a special two-part series that we're doing. And this is part one of the series. And this is about vampires, vampire lore, and vampires in film specifically. So, we're doing this episode so that we have a more in-depth understanding when we talk about the film, which we will do on our next episode, Nosferatu, which is out
Yeah,
in theaters right now.
we've been talking about watching Nosferatu for a while, but then we had this idea because Erin's kind of an expert on vampire lore, and I am not. So
Yeah,
I just wanted to tell you, Erin, before we got started, a little bit
sure.
about my understanding and history
Yeah, let's
of
talk about your vampire history. Let's go into
vampires.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
How's your experience? What do you know about them? What's
Well, I
what's
have a
happened?
condition called vasovagal,
Oh shit. All right.
which is when
Explain to the audience what that is.
vasovagal, vagal, vagavasal. Well, basically what it is when I
I'm
see
laughing. It's
blood,
not funny. It's like
it
not
is
funny.
funny. When I
Yeah.
see blood, I get an adrenaline spike and then my blood pressure drops. So I'm a fainter. So when
Yep.
you hear about people fainting when they see blood, it's vasovagal.
Hmm.
And so I have sort of been deterred from vampire stuff my whole entire life. That being said, there was
Yes.
big trending stuff when we were like the 90s, and Rice had a lot of novels. Interview with a Vampire is very popular. And anyways, that's about, oh, and then I read the Twilight series randomly. I just
Hmm.
wanted to be included. Everybody was talking about it. And I was like, I can't, I need to know. And because I had missed the boat on Harry Potter, and I was like, I gotta be in on this one. Like to this day,
Yeah.
all Harry Potter lore is lost on me. So anyway, those are my two real experiences with vampires, and that's about as far as it goes. So this is what we're walking into. I'm gonna be doing a lot of listening, a
Okay.
lot of like,
Well, you got to ask questions because I'm sure
I
that
will, of
there's a lot of
course.
other people who don't have a certain understanding. And I just want to put this out there too. I'm not necessarily a vampire expert. I'm just somebody who loves monster movies. I love all of that kind of stuff. And so that's been part of why I happen to know a lot a bit about vampires and specifically vampires in film because I think they're interesting. You know, monsters we've talked about this before, always represent something else. And a vampire usually is foreign. They're coming from a foreign place into a culture and they're bringing death and disease, which what does that represent? The fear of the other, right? That can be like a fear of what immigrants bring because Count Dracula and Count Orloff are foreigners coming into a setting. But we'll get more into that. So the myth of vampires has really ancient roots, evolving over centuries from folklore, superstition, and cultural beliefs. While the specifics vary across different cultures, here's an overview of how the vampire myth actually began. And it goes back to Mesopotamian legends. One of the earliest legends of vampiric creatures comes from Mesopotamian mythology. Figures like Lilitu, a demon associated with night terrors and seduction, and Lamashtu, a blood drinking demon, were featured as malevolent beings who preyed on humans. You can then even go to Greek mythology. We see Ampusa, Lamia, and Strigus were creatures that fed on blood or the life essence of people. Lamia, for example, was a serpent like being that hunted children, while Strigas were bird like witches who drank blood. Of course, more people are more familiar with maybe some of the Slavic references to vampires. The Slavic regions are often considered the birthplace of the modern vampire myth, in that their stories describe the vampire, a revenant or a restless corpse, who would rise from the grave to feed on the living. These vampires were often associated with death, disease, and pestilence, often blamed for unexplained deaths or illnesses in a community.
So when you say Slavic, you mean I want to suck your blood.
Right. Yeah. So we're talking
Okay.
about like the Romanian area, which when you think of if we had a map, these are countries that are also were kind of on the edge of the Ottoman Empire. So you're dealing with a region that has seen a lot of transitions, has had a lot of conflict, and is also getting a lot of different belief systems coming in and out. Um, and so you have, you know, in the traditional vampire legend, what scares vampires? The cross. Okay. So if you like show a vampire cross and they like pull away, well, they're not Christian, right? So it's kind of this another way that we're establishing a fear of the other. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
What is the Ottoman Empire?
Where we now have like Iran and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and the Ottoman Empire had been, even at certain points they had would fight with Greece, tried to take over Greece. I don't know if they ever had control of Greece, but the Ottoman Empire had been established for a very long time as another it's an empire, right? So they were touching and had occupied even parts of what is today considered like modern Russia. They had been going further west into Europe, and Europe, part of the Crusades, the knights went over to the east and were fighting back against the Ottomans. And it was declared like a Christian war, that we have to fight this war. And the guys were getting, pulled in because they're looking for the Holy Grail. And it's this holy war. And part of the idea of the Holy War is that they're going against an empire that was associated with Muslims. But also, there's this time period where it's like people would die of different things and no one had a real explanation. So it was easier in some ways to say, oh, there's a vampire around here. That's why all these people are dying. There's a vampire. To explain instead, if somebody has any number of illnesses that they would die from at that point in time when there's not like a strong level of communication tools or medicine and doctors that are part of these more rural communities, you would see a deeper belief of supernatural things occurring that would affect people, and often a deeper tie to religious beliefs as a source of protection.
We often see that still, people going outside themselves to explain what they can't understand, what their brain will not let them accept.
So Eastern Europe, and I apologize when I was saying when you asked me about the Slavic regions, Romania is not part of the Slavic regions. The We're talking about like Slovakia, and I wish I had a map in front of me because I could specifically tell you, but it's further east to Romania. Romania is closer to Europe. So Eastern European beliefs in Romania, say it's part of Eastern Europe, the strigoi were spirits of the dead who could rise from their graves, and in Serbia, the vampire was a revenant that drained the life force of the living. So again, something from the dead rising again, pulling off the life force. Obviously, this ties into a fear of the undead. During the medieval period, misunderstandings about decomposition and disease fueled fears of the undead. For example, the corpses that appeared bloated or had blood seeping from their mouths were often suspected of being vampires. Christian teachings about the sanctity of the soul and burial rites contributed to vampire lore as well. The idea of an unclean soul rising from the grave resonated with fears of sin and damnation. So, a child dying before they had been baptized, they possibly could be a vampire. A woman who speaks too loudly and has beliefs against the rest of the community, she might be a vampire. Someone we don't know who maybe looks a little bit different or acts a little bit different and the community's scared and we need somebody to blame, that might be a vampire. So similar to where we would say this person's a witch, or you might be more familiar with that. People were actually accused of being vampires if they were outside of they were the other. They're not part of the norm, or they're a troublemaker, or they've done something that would consider them to be quote, unclean as far as, their lifestyle, which could even be like a woman having a child out of wedlock. She could potentially be a vampire. So, anyway,
You could potentially call anything you didn't like unclean.
yeah, Yeah.
You
I mean,
talk
and
back
like,
to me, you're unclean.
yeah. And I mean,
You
maybe we'll do,
disagree with me, you're unclean.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. It gives you a really wide margin to just mark people off. That's something that, there's been a lot of other things. We just to go back to witches. I mean, we can talk about like the witch trials. We're all generally familiar with what happened in Salem. These are moments where people are terrified and they need somebody to blame. And so they find people to blame. And then they blame their neighbor for their cow dying. They blame this, they blame that. And next thing you know, there's a lot of people who are terrified who are all on board because they don't want to be the next person who's called a witch. They don't want to be the next person who's, up on trial for something that's completely arbitrary, but is then taking the blame for things that nobody else has an explanation for.
Right.
And there's this need to have an explanation for things to make things more easier to deal with when you live in a world where you don't understand. There's also this idea, right, of blood being life essence. And across many cultures, blood was seen as a source of vitality and life. You can even think about, like, in Christianity, when you have communion, like, this is my body I've shed for you. This is like my blood. So
Mhm.
you're drinking the wine or juice, that's the blood. The bread is the body. That's associated again with like blood is life essence, that you're
Mhm.
taking the blood of Christ as a way to have connection, higher connection with God and, you know, respect and understanding of Christ and all that kind of stuff for your soul in a way.
Mhm.
The idea of drinking blood to sustain life or power was deeply rooted in both spiritual and physical beliefs. So, in the 17th and 18th century, the vampire epidemic, which was in parts of Eastern Europe, started, where villagers exhumed bodies to stake or burn suspected vampires. These panics were often followed after outbreaks of the plague or other diseases, which were attributed to vampiric activity.
Mhm.
During this period, scholars and clergy began documenting vampire cases. In literature, we start to see the vampire come more into literature. In 1819, the book The Vampire by John Polidori introduced the aristocratic vampire. What's really cool about
Oh,
this specific book,
aristocratic. Yeah.
so
Hmm.
what's fun about this book is John Polidori was visiting his friend, Lord Byron, and there was a couple there, which were the Shelleys. And who do we
Hmm.
know wrote Frankenstein? Mary
Mary
Shelley.
Shelley.
So that weekend, they couldn't go outside. There had been a lot of volcanic activity. So that was actually the year 1819, which they called the year with no sun, when the sky was always gray and there was just all this ash in the clouds. So they didn't really want to go outside. They're like, let's hang out inside. Let's have a little game. And it's called like kind of who can write a scary story. Like, let's all take turns writing scary stories. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. She wrote the
Mhm.
beginnings of Frankenstein. And John Polidori wrote The Vampire,
Wow.
which later, yeah, I mean, that's a crazy weekend. And you can kind of understand,
Yeah.
in the early 1800s, we're entering into this period where the Industrial Revolution, people getting more interested in the sciences, but in like electricity and how things are going to move and having these certain understandings. We're not fully there, but it's like
Mhm.
right at the beginnings of those huge technological shifts and changes that are happening. And in those writings, they're curious about science in regard to
The
death, right?
Oh, yeah.
Frankenstein is all about a doctor who wants to understand the ability of life. He wants to be able to conquer death by bringing something back to life.
Mhm.
And in his story, he does that to horrible end.
There's nothing like that people love talking about more than the devil and evil when there is some sort of technological shift, some huge influence on society where everything's going to change. I mean, it causes a slight mass hysteria because when we all have to do something differently at the same exact time, we get afraid. And
Yeah.
where do we turn to when we're afraid? Sources of comfort and people we trust. And if we're
Yes.
supposed to trust, if you're talking about how religious leaders started to document this stuff, respected people in the community, and those are the
Hmm.
people we trust. Well, what a more wonderful way to just make the entire world freak out, then documenting cases of evil and the devil and some new person to blame. And it is the great distractor from what is actually happening. And then once people get over it and see, that
Yeah.
everything's going to be okay, there they are with all the technology waiting for them right in front of them.
Yeah, of course. Totally. I totally agree with that. I almost feel, this it's definitely a tool of political manipulation. If you can keep people afraid and looking the wrong way, you can get away with a lot more because they're not paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to what they really should be paying attention to. They're more
Mm-hmm.
excited by the thrill of what seems more threatening, even though it might not be. Good point, Em. Good point. So, the other most famous novel is Dracula, Bram Stoker's, which I have my copy of Dracula right here.
Yeah, great.
Bram Stoker's
Scary.
Dracula. I actually
Scary
have
cover.
scary cover. Yeah, I actually have Dracula Omnibus because this has all three. There's like three books in the Dracula series. It's Dracula, The Lair of the White Worm, and Dracula's Guest. Bram Stoker's Dracula, written in 1897, synthesized centuries of folklore into the iconic figure of Count Dracula, cementing many vampire traits. So, what had been happening also in 1897, right before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, in Connecticut, where he had lived for a period of time. Now, Bram Stoker, he's Irish, right? So he's over in New England, and in the 1800s, 18th and 19th centuries, there was a tuberculosis epidemic happening. TB was the leading cause of death in New England. It caused symptoms like pale skin, weight loss, and blood-filled coughing, which
Yikes.
made sufferers appear as if they were being drained of life. So villagers, those that had died of TB, might rise from their graves to feed on their living relatives, spreading the disease. This belief was likely fueled by the lack of understanding of germ theory and the eerie progression of the tuberculosis symptoms. So here's a specific case. In 1892, Mercy Brown was a young woman who died of tuberculosis. After other family members also fell ill, her body was exhumed to see if she was feeding on the living. Her body, well preserved due to the cold weather, was deemed suspicious. Her heart was removed, burned, and mixed into a tonic meant to cure her brother, who was sick with tuberculosis, but he died soon after.
Yeah, because he
Um,
got her weird diseased heart germs.
well, yeah, but he also already had tuberculosis.
Okay.
So, like, feeding him a burnt, charred up heart
Gross.
milkshake from his
This
dead
is
sister isn't really going to help him, you know? Like,
disgusting.
yikes.
All
And
right.
that was in Exeter, Rhode Island, right? Then earlier than that, in Connecticut, Jewett City vampires, 1854. In the town of Jewett City, Connecticut, the Ray family experienced several deaths also attributed to tuberculosis. Believing that a deceased family member was preying on the living, the locals exhumed and burned the bodies of those who had died. Throughout Connecticut and neighboring states, families exhumed corpses suspected of vampirism. Rituals included removing and burning internal organs, rearranging bones, and even decapitating corpses to prevent further attacks.
All
So
right.
this was all stuff that was coming up in the paper, and Bram Stoker's like, what is going on here? So this is all fuel and inspiration for the novel that later comes out. Dracula, 1897. So
I
we can
do.
kind of see a correlation between like stuff happening in the news, and then he writes this novel, which
A
becomes a really big hit.
few years back, everyone was talking about cloning and like because of all these science advancements we've had recently. And then all of a sudden, all these movies are popping up about clones suddenly, like literally
Perfect. Okay,
everywhere.
that's a perfect transition because now I'm going to get into film, vampires
Right.
and
Because
film.
absolutely do not waste a crisis. The
Yes.
entertainment industry never
Yeah.
wastes a crisis.
Sadly, yes.
Hmm.
Uh, so let's talk about early silent films like the 1910s and the 1920s.
Hmm.
Vampires first entered cinema as early as the silent film era in the 1913 Hungarian film, Dracula's Death, is one of the earliest vampire-related films, though its narrative diverges from Bram Stoker's Dracula. So it's got a different storyline, but they still call the guy Dracula. Nosferatu, which came out in 1922,
Mhm.
was a German expressionist masterpiece and perhaps the most iconic early vampire film. An unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel, it introduced Count Orlok, a grotesque and rat-like figure that remains a symbol of the eerie and inhumane aspects of the vampires. He comes in that film and brings plague, death, disease. He overtakes trying to, get the fiance of his land agent as he's moved from, Eastern Europe to London. What I think is also really interesting, this is just from a film perspective, when people were moving into film, there was a different thing happening in film in the United States than was happening in Europe. And
Mhm.
Germany in particular was really doing more of like an expressionist movement with film. And a
Mhm.
lot of their films had a totally different feel than what was happening in the United States. In the United States, they were using film and shooting film similar to how they would like a play, like a stage play, right? So it's like
Mhm.
the person's doing this. I'm walking on this side of the stage. Now I'm on this side of the stage. The person comes up, da da da. Whereas in Germany, they're using more light. They're playing with more light. They're playing with more depth. They're using more expressionism. They're using more symbolism. Later, those two things come together, especially when we see, the period of we have sound converging with film. And we're linking, the silent picture era ends and we get into talkies. You even still see at that point in time the way that you can watch a film, early, talkie films very much still like a play, and the acting is that way. Whereas with German filmmaking at that time, they had a focus more on realism. So later, those things come together, and
Mhm.
that's more of how we watch films now, where people act in a more realistic way. It's not as theatrical. And also, a lot of the actors don't have that theatrical training that back then all actors had because that was mostly what they were doing, right? So,
Yeah. So that really must make it scarier because if you think about the dramatics of like doing something more like a stage, you have a lady with her hand over her head. Oh, there's this distinguishing element from reality. So it's like you
exactly.
can't feel safe from it. But when you start using more expressionism and start mirroring actual human behavior and actual human environments, then
Yes.
you start losing that line and it becomes way more terrifying.
Yes, yes. And the use of shadows, the use of light. And when you watch, and even if you've ever seen a photo from the film, the 1922 Nosferatu, he's scary. He looks really scary. He looks
Yeah.
really tall. His fingers are really long. He's
Mhm.
grotesque looking, and he's like very pale in this like dark background. It's scary.
Yeah.
It can really get you there.
Yeah.
Um,
Rats are gross. Rats
Rats
are
are
nasty. Yeah. Okay.
We then later move into Universal Monsters era, which was 1930s to 1940s. Dracula, 1931, with the famous Bela Lugosi portrayal of Count Dracula in the Universal Pictures Dracula, set the template for the suave, aristocratic vampire. The film cemented the association between vampires and sexuality, with Lugosi's Dracula exuding charm and menace.
Yeah.
Sequels and spin offs, films like Dracula's Daughter in 1936 and The Son of Dracula in 1943, explored new dimensions of the vampire mythos. Vampires became tied to the themes of death, seduction, and exoticism, influenced by the Gothic aesthetic.
Mhm.
And in post war, there was a Gothic revival. So from the 1950s to the 1960s, you see Hammer Horror Films, which was a British studio, revitalized the vampire cinema with vivid color, gore, and sensuality. That's when we get in Christopher Lee's menacing and magnetic portrayal of Dracula in Horror of Dracula in 1958, which redefined the character. What's really funny about this film specifically actually has nothing to do with the film. My dad when I told him I was working on a vampire episode, he sent me a text and he was like, I saw The Horror of Dracula when I was 8 years old. It's
What?
still the scariest movie I have ever seen in my life. It scared me so badly. I got nightmares for, you know,
Uh,
weeks after. And it's a pretty cool film actually to watch, to have an understanding vampires kind of dipped out for a second. So it's like, yeah, there was stuff happening in like 1943 with Son of Dracula, but it's not until really 1958 we have him come back. And or like the idea of, I'm sure there was other smaller films, but I'm talking like major level stuff that was happening. And Christopher Lee, his Dracula is scary and he's
yeah.
evil and he looks actually more like the cover of the Bram Stoker's book that I just showed you. And for people who are just listening to the podcast, it's like a charcoal drawing in color of just like a man's face, his mouth's open and his fangs all showing.
Arr.
There was also this film called The Vampire Lovers, which came out in 1970. Carmilla-based adaptation devolved into lesbian undertones and eroticism, reflecting changing societal norms. Because what was also happening in 1970? We've come off of the civil rights movement, which was still in full swing, but then there's the women's rights movement. And so people are being more accepting of lesbianism. But you know what? If you're a lesbian, you might be a vampire.
Blame the lesbians. Blame the lesbians. There's
They're
nothing
dangerous.
scarier
A
than
woman who
two
likes a
women.
woman. Yeah, exactly.
You mean there's
Exactly.
no man around to temper her genius?
Yeah. She must be a monster. She's
She
not controllable. Yeah. American Renaissance films like Blackula, which came out in 1972, brought vampires into the context of African American culture during the blaxploitation era. Meanwhile, Salem's Lot in 1979 adapted Stephen King's take on vampires. Artistic and art house interpretations included Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire in 1979, reimagining Murnau's classic and combining existential dread with the stunning visuals. Films like The Lost Boys in 1987, which one of my favorite vampire films because it's got a huge weird rock and roll scene where a saxophonist is shirtless and all muscly and gives this weird like saxophone solo.
Yeah.
Crazy. That movie is so funny.
So Lost Boys is sort of like the 80s vampire version of The Outsiders.
Uh, so that I like that interpretation. Lost Boys is so campy. It's so funny. To me,
Yeah,
it's very funny.
it's very
So
campy.
anyway, yeah. So Lost Boys in 1987 and Near Dark also in 1987 infused vampire lore with punk aesthetics and youth culture. Then in the 90s and 2000s, there was, of course, many of the blockbusters and more of a romantic spin with Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, which reintroduced the novel's epic scope, and that has Winona Ryder in it, if you're not familiar. And it reintroduced the novel's epic scope with Interview of a Vampire, which we know had Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, offering an introspective and romanticized view of immortal life.
Mhm.
And there was TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, 97 to 2003, and
I did watch that.
yeah, and Angel, which explored vampires as complex, relatable characters. And
Hmm.
in Asian cinema, films like Thirst, which came out in 2009 by Park Chan-wook, brought new cultural perspectives and artistic innovation to the genre. Contemporarily, there's the teen romance boom with the Twilight movement, which happened, or the Twilight saga, sorry, from 2008 to 2012, which reshaped vampires for a younger, more mainstream audience, focusing on romance and moral dilemmas.
Yeah.
Then, of course, there's the film Let the Right One In, which is a Swedish film that came out in 2008, and its American remake, Let Me In, which was in 2010, which focused on psychological depth and unconventional storytelling. Now, if you haven't seen Let the Right
I
One In,
haven't. I haven't. I've
that
heard
is
about
an
that, but I didn't know it was a vampire
absolute,
movie.
as even just like as film in general, that is an absolute, you have to watch that film. You
Okay.
have to. To me, that's one of my favorite films. It's
Wait, what movie?
beautiful.
It's Swedish?
Yeah, Let the
Hmm.
Right One In. There is blood in it. That might be tough for you, but
I'll
it's a
live.
vampire movie.
It's not so bad anymore. We used to be
Um,
worse.
Then, as we've gotten into the streaming era, we have shows like What We Do in the Shadows, which is actually based on the film What We Do in the Shadows, which came out first and is very funny. And that's a parody of vampire tropes, blending comedy and horror. It's, has a documentary team who's like following this group of vampires who all live together and kind of just documenting their lives. And they do like one-on-one interviews with the documentary crew. And then we see scenes, and they're roommates. So they're like, I asked them to clean up the bodies and I don't know
Yeah.
why it's so hard. House meeting. It's like all that kind of stuff. It's very,
Yeah.
very funny. It's one of my favorite shows. It actually just wrapped, but it's really fun. It's just a very fun, easy watch. So these recent works explore multicultural and queer interpretations of vampire stories, reflecting the evolving societal landscape. Themes and cultural significance. Vampires in film have consistently represented societal fears and desires, whether as metaphors for disease, outsiders, forbidden sexuality, or eternal youth. Each era's take on the vampire mirrors the anxieties and fantasies of the time, ensuring the mythos remains evergreen.
That was very good. I will say the one thing that it doesn't really address is how we've adopted it, like as a society, to describe people who take and take and take and take from you. Like maybe narcissists, we
Oh,
call them vampires.
it could
And
be.
yeah,
Well, that's like
and
an energy vampire, right? There's
right.
definitely those that exist.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
and I will say that it does make so much sense about disease because they didn't have the science to explain why someone was pale. And also later on the aristocrat, like when people start struggling financially, it's like stress. They didn't have the science to describe stress's effect on the body. So all of a sudden people are pale and look dazed and all this stuff from being stressed out about money and instability in their home lives and in their financial lives, and the stress starts taking a toll on their bodies, and they didn't have the science to explain that, and so then we have to blame that on a vampire, and
Yeah.
it's just interesting how fantastical
Hmm.
explanations for what we cannot confront yet,
Yeah.
or what we don't have the tools to confront yet,
Yeah.
pop up
Yeah.
in these times of chaos. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I won't bring up examples for recent history, but I will say that we have seen a lot of that in the news, a lot of conspiracy stuff, all that. So that all starts popping up when inner turmoil is occurring.
Yeah. And talking about conspiracy theories, I mean, you could say this was an example of what a conspiracy theory was at that point in time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like this person's a vampire. Vampires are real. Vampires are real. Well, it's like, what are you talking? How would vampires be real? If you take a
Yeah.
second to step back, it's logical that that's not true. But
Yeah.
when you're caught up in the moment and you're scared
Mm-hmm.
and you're looking desperately for answers, and a bunch of people around you are like, yeah, nope, that must be it. Let's just go with this. It's
Mm-hmm.
very easy to get swept up in the crowd.
Yeah.
So I have this really cool book. It's old, so the cover's kind of like ripped. It's called In Search of Dracula: A True History of Dracula and Vampire Legends. I've had this for a
Mm-hmm.
while. It's really fun. I think there's just so much stuff you can go out and look at. This book has like pictures of castles, the ruins of Castle Dracula. So Dracula is known still to this day as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, even though his contemporaries knew him as Dracula. And this is because he had a way of capturing people and impaling them. And it didn't matter who you were, he's just going to impale you, kill you. He had this he had a morbid inventiveness which may have well inspired the Marquis de Sade, who was no doubt familiar with his crimes. In regard to the cruel techniques practiced in our so called enlightened 20th century, Dracula set another shining precedent. He generally demanded confessions prior to punishment, sometimes a way of escaping partial or even total violence, and often he scaled the severity of the punishment to the instinctively self preservative wit of his potential victim. There were instances when a man doomed to destruction was able to save his life with some happy or flattering phrase. Most of Dracula's Transylvanian atrocities occurred between 1459 and 1461.
Well, Erin, I feel like really prepared to go into watching Nosferatu this weekend.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like that was like a tall stack of interesting facts for me to take with me as I watch this film. I don't love vampire stuff, as we've talked about, but I do feel more in control of my circumstances in the sense of the information I will be taking in, and therefore, in context, might feel a little less terrified.
Perfect. That's all I wanted you to have as your tools before you walk in to see the film. Now, I have seen the film. I'm not going to talk about the film, and I don't want to talk too much about the books that I mentioned because I feel like it might give too much away from the plot. Have you seen Bram Stoker's Dracula that came out like in the 90s?
I don't think so.
Okay. Because they do certain nods to that film and they do a nod to Nosferatu, like the original. But that doesn't matter. Have a wonderful time and enjoy it. And dear sweet audience, I hope you get a chance to watch this film, Nosferatu, this weekend before we talk about it next week. And I hope that you enjoy this week's double podcast. Thank you for
Yes.
tuning in.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in. Let's just end this podcast with a popular meme from the early 2000s that goes, blood. Do you remember that meme?
No.
Blood,
Blood.
blood. It's this little kid and his dad has some blood on him and he's terrified and he just keeps going, blood, blood,
Blood. Blood.
daddy, blood. It's
Oh
not
my
blood. Blood.
God.
I'm gonna show it to you. All right. Anyways, as always, go to our Instagram page, follow us there, comment feedback, and don't forget to leave us a 5-star review wherever you are listening to podcasts. Every star and review helps us keep doing what we're doing, and we love doing this, and we want to keep doing it forever. So make sure
Yes.
you tell a friend and
Yes.
all of
And
that.
all of what Emmy said. Thank you again for your support. It means the world to us. See you
Okay,
next
see you
time.
Tuesday. Bye.
Bye.